welcome to the Advanced Placement World History Podcast. This is episode 25, The 20th Century, A New Period in World History. So, we're at Unit 5, the last unit of AP World History, and like all the other periods we've studied, the 20th century carries on some characteristics from the past and also develops its own unique characteristics. So, there are plenty of continuities and plenty of changes with the history that came before the 20th century. And in Unit 5, we want to highlight both these continuities and these changes. Our first major theme of Unit 5 will be Europe and the World Wars. The first half of the 20th century is really dominated by the World Wars, and in the broadest sense, the World Wars were the ultimate result of Europe's inability to create a unified European civilization, something like China had accomplished thousands of years earlier. So, we've looked at this idea of political fragmentation in Europe and decentralization following the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century, and initially this political fragmentation put Europe at somewhat of a disadvantage. Europe was in turmoil for much of the Middle Ages. We know sometimes these are called the Dark Ages. We also know this term, the Dark Ages, is Eurocentric because during these so-called Dark Ages there were other civilizations in the world, most notably the Islamic Caliphates and China, Tang and Song, that were experiencing golden ages during Europe's Dark Ages. And these civilizations that were experiencing their golden ages were much more unified civilizations. We looked at how eventually the unity of some of these more advanced civilizations, especially China, begins to work against them. And a good example of this is the maritime voyages of Zheng He in China. At the beginning of the 15th century, China was really in a position to travel to America before Europeans, and had they gotten there, they would have been the first to encounter the wealth of the Americas and could have used this wealth to their own advantage. But something that was holding China back was that China simply didn't really have the same degree of motivation for exploration as Europeans had. Europeans needed to embark on these big ocean-going voyages because they wanted to get into the Asian markets, and China was already central to these markets, so they were less motivated to embark on maritime voyages. And when the Chinese court decided that they were going to stop pursuing the voyages, that was it. When there's a central authority, all it takes is that one decision. And you can compare that to Europe, where there are many different states. If Spain didn't fund Columbus, then Portugal or England or France or Holland all could have. So you have lots of these powers, and these powers are in competition with each other. So now this political fragmentation becomes Europe's advantage. But in a way, the World Wars are just a continuation of this historical process of competition between politically fragmented European states. More recent to the history of the World Wars, you have the European conflicts of the early modern era and the 19th century. But if the World Wars are a continuation of this older process of political fragmentation in Europe, they also present something new in the fact that they were really the most destructive wars in history, with entire populations mobilized to fight in war, nearly all able-bodied men fighting as soldiers. There were never this many people killed in combat or killed as prisoners before. Hitler's extermination of the Jews and the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki really represented a new level of human destruction. And that's not to say that there haven't been human-created disasters before the World Wars. Historians place the death toll of the Taiping Rebellion somewhere between 20 and 30 million. But a lot of this was opposed to famine as opposed to lives lost actually on the battlefield. Up to 90% of the indigenous population of America died after European contact, but this was primarily because of disease as opposed to lives lost due to military firepower. Our second major theme will be communism, and the rise of communism in the 20th century is also really a combination of old and new, or continuities and changes. In the 20th century, we have two massive communist revolutions, first in Russia than in China. And these Russian and Chinese revolutions go on to create this new global division in humanity, countries that support capitalism and countries that support communism. The underlying political beliefs of the communist movement were influenced by the German philosopher and economist Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto was written in 1848, but really the communist movement that emerges in the 20th century in both Russia and China is very much a continuation of older processes. In both China and Russia, the driving force behind the communist revolutions was conflict between the poor and exploited peasant class and the wealthy landlord classes who dominated the peasants. Throughout both Chinese and Russian history, this has been a conflict that's reared its head over and over and over again. So, in China, for example, we've seen countless peasant led rebellions against landlords, and often these rebellions lead to regime change. We learned about all the different dynasties in China, and we know that peasant unrest is a common feature in the overthrow of really all these dynasties. Our third major theme in Unit 5 is the disintegration of the world's most powerful empires. And in the long view of world history, this collapse of world empires happens very suddenly, very abruptly. In the 20th century, we see the end of the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Soviet Empire, and what we see is the emergence of more and more nation states. By the beginning of the 21st century, we have a world of more than 200 nation states, which is a far cry from the turn of the 20th century, where most of the world was under the power of a small handful of imperial powers. In terms of continuities, this process of the falling of empires dates way back to Mesopotamia with the Babylonians and the Assyrians, but there's a bigger change here. In the 20th century, that very idea of empire is made illegitimate in a way that was similar to the idea of slavery becoming illegitimate in the 19th century. The two superpowers of the second half of the 20th century, the United States and the Soviet Union, both claimed that they were against empires, against colonialism, but at the same time, both the United States and the Soviet Union continued to practice colonialism, but now it's a different variation of colonialism, and we'll look at this practice of neocolonialism in the 20th century. If the world wars, the division of the world into East and West camps, or capitalist and communist camps, and the end of empires, or at least empires how they once were, are the most obvious themes of the 20th century, there are some other less obvious themes that we're also going to address that might be equally important. The first and foremost of these less obvious themes is the explosive population growth of the 20th century. Human population on Earth will quadruple between the years 1900 and 2000. The population of the world at 2008 is 6.7 billion people. So this is massive population growth, and this is both new because never before had the population of the whole world increased at such a rapid rate, but this population growth wouldn't have been possible without two key earlier developments. The first development is the introduction of American food crops, such as corn and potatoes, to Africa and Eurasia, made possible by the Columbian Exchange. The second is improvements in medicine and sanitation, made possible by the scientific and industrial revolutions. This possible growth, combined with scientific and industrial revolution, also creates a new theme of the 20th century, and this is human beings' destructive impact on the global environment. So both the industrial and scientific revolutions start in Europe, but by the end of the 20th century, these revolutions have really spread all over the globe. And the notion of humans impacting their environment is nothing new. We've seen it in the Fertile Crescent, happens in Easter Island, Yucatan Peninsula, and the collapse of the Maya. But now this environmental damage is happening on a much more global scale. The final theme of Unit 5 will be a theme we've been discussing really since Episode 7, Roads of Silk, Sea and Sand, and this is the concept of globalization, the long historical process of bringing world markets into one big trading network. So if you go back to podcast episode 7, I talked about the Silk Road Trading Network, Indian Ocean Trading Network, the Trans-Saharan Trading Network. We go through the spread of religions, the three religions that were most successful at spreading out of their homeland in world history were Christianity, Buddhism, and then finally Islam. Then we have new connections of the Columbian Exchange, which brings really the first global trading network. But in the 20th century, connections between people from distant places around the globe were made far easier and made far more frequently through inventions like the radio, television, and the internet. Environmental problems are now globalized, are now a global issue. Climate change will affect the entire planet. And now global inequalities, the global divide between rich and poor, are much more obvious than ever before, and in many instances, these global inequalities are driving global conflicts. So there are going to be 4 more podcasts in Unit 5. The first 3 podcasts are going to focus on the big themes of the 20th century. Episode 26 will look at the world of Western capitalism. By the 20th century, Europe had become the center of the global economy, but in the early 20th century, Europe will experience a monumental collapse and descend into a state of war, followed by economic depression, followed by more war. The Western world will eventually recover in the second half of the United States, but the leadership of the Western world will pass on to the United States. In episode 27, we look at the communist challenge to Western capitalism, and we'll study the global communist phenomenon. We'll look at the revolutionary origins of communism, especially in Russia and China, the efforts of China and Russia to build new socialist societies, and the global conflict of the Cold War that pitted communism against capitalism, and then finally, the sudden and dramatic collapse of communism towards the end of the 20th century. In episode 28, we turn the spotlight back on the former colonial worlds of Asia and Africa. First, we will look at the many struggles of independence that emerged at the end of the Age of Empires and the emergence of new independent nation-states in Africa and Asia, and we'll look at how these newly independent African and Asian states are occupying an increasing important role on the world stage. At the turn of the 21st century, these Asian and African states are much, much more powerful than they were at the turn of the 20th century. These 3 themes are part of a much larger story, which is the story of globalization, and this will be the theme of episode 29, which will be the course's final podcast. So I'll just give you an idea of what we have coming ahead in Unit 5. This is the end of episode 25. Thank you for listening.